That river will kill every man who tries to cross it!
That river will kill every man who tries to cross it. That's what the lead engineer told his commanding officer while 47 vehicles sat stranded on a muddy riverbank in the middle of nowhere, Georgia. Rain had been falling for 6 straight days. The Chattahoochee tributary they were supposed to ford had turned into a rolling brown monster, 15 feet wider than the map said it should be, moving fast enough to drag a deuce and a half downstream like a bathtub toy. 312 soldiers watched as $250,000 worth of portable bridging equipment sat half-deployed on the bank, its hydraulic system bleeding fluid into the mud like a wounded animal. And while officers screamed into radios and junior engineers punched numbers into laptops that kept telling them the same thing, impossible, impossible, impossible. One man walked to the edge of the water, knelt down, pressed his hand flat against the current and said 5 words that changed everything. "I've crossed worse than this." He was 71 years old. If this story moves you, type "bridge" in the comments, and make sure you subscribe, because what happened next proved that experience will always outrun technology when it matters most. His name was Leonard Decka, and he had no business being there, not officially. Leonard was a civilian contractor attached to the 74th Engineer Battalion as a technical advisor, a title that sounded important on paper but mostly meant he rode in the back of a Humvee, drank bad coffee from a thermos he'd carried since 1983, and offered suggestions that the younger soldiers politely ignored. He was lean and weathered, the kind of thin that comes not from dieting but from decades of physical work that never quite stopped. His face was a topographical map of hard living, deep creases around his eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from a fence post, and hands so scarred and calloused they barely looked like hands at all. He wore the same faded olive-drab jacket every day, no patches, no insignia, just a jacket that had clearly been washed 1,000 times and refused to fall apart. The younger soldiers called him Pops behind his back, and sometimes to his face, and Leonard never corrected them. He just smiled that quiet half-smile of his, and kept his thoughts where he always kept them, somewhere behind those pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink when they were studying something. The training exercise was called Operation River Forge, and it was supposed to be a straightforward logistics deployment. The 74th had been tasked with moving a full convoy, supply trucks, command vehicles, mobile communication units, and 2 M88 recovery vehicles across a mapped river crossing point 60 miles south of Fort Benning. The exercise was designed to test the battalion's ability to deploy its improved ribbon bridge system under realistic field conditions. Captain Eric Maddox, the company commander, had briefed the exercise 3 times. He had maps, satellite imagery from the week prior, flow rate calculations, and a deployment timeline that had been reviewed and approved all the way up to battalion level. Everything was planned, everything was precise, and none of it accounted for the fact that 6 days of relentless rain had turned a manageable waterway into something that belonged in a disaster relief briefing. They arrived at the crossing point at 06:30 on a Tuesday morning, and the mood shifted the moment the lead vehicles crested the ridge overlooking the river. What should have been a 40-foot crossing with a moderate current was now closer to 60 feet of churning brown water carrying branches, debris, and enough force to make the ground vibrate under their boots. Staff Sergeant Brian Coyle, the senior bridging NCO, was the first one to say it out loud. "That's not what was on the imagery." Captain Maddox stood at the bank with his arms folded, watching the water like it had personally insulted him. "Get the ribbon bridge prepped. We'll adjust the span calculations and make it work." Coyle hesitated. "Sir, the flow rate on this. I'm not sure the anchoring system is rated for—" "I said get it prepped, Sergeant." And so they prepped it. The improved ribbon bridge is an impressive piece of engineering. Each aluminum bay unfolds from a specialized truck, and when linked together and launched across a waterway, the bays form a floating roadway capable of supporting main battle tanks. The system is fast, modular, and designed for exactly this kind of scenario. Except it wasn't designed for this kind of scenario. Not really. Not when the current was running at nearly 7 knots, and the riverbed was shifting with every passing minute. The first bay went into the water at 07:45. By 08:15, the hydraulic deployment arm on the second bridge truck had seized. Coyle's team spent 40 minutes trying to troubleshoot it, before discovering that a seal in the hydraulic pump had failed, probably from the cold and the moisture that had been seeping into the equipment during the long wet drive to the crossing site. Without that second truck, they couldn't complete the span. They had half a bridge and a river that was getting angrier by the hour. Maddox got on the radio to Battalion. Battalion told him to figure it out. He got on the radio to the maintenance support team. They were 4 hours away and dealing with 2 other breakdowns on different exercise lanes. He stood at the bank and stared at the water and did the math in his head and came up with the same answer the laptops kept giving him. They were stuck. Leonard had been watching the whole thing from beside his Humvee, about 30 yards back from the bank. He'd been watching the way he always watched, quietly, with that thermos in his hand and his eyes moving from the water to the equipment to the soldiers and back to the water. He watched Coyle's team struggle with the hydraulics. He watched the junior engineers argue about flow rate calculations. He watched Maddox's face go from confident to frustrated to something close to desperate. And he watched the river. He watched it the way a man watches something he recognizes. Not with fear, not with confusion, with familiarity. The way you watch an old opponent you've faced before and beaten. It was Specialist Rivera who finally said something. She'd been assigned as Leonard's driver for the exercise, and she'd spent enough time around him to know that his silence wasn't empty. "Mr. Decka," she said, standing next to him at the Humvee, "you've been staring at that river for an hour." Leonard took a sip from his thermos. "Yep. You got an idea?" He didn't answer right away. He watched a log the size of a telephone pole roll through the current, snag briefly on something beneath the surface, then tear free and continue downstream. He tracked it with his eyes until it disappeared around the bend. Then he set his thermos on the hood of the Humvee and said, "Take me down to the captain." Rivera looked at him for a moment, then nodded and started walking. Leonard followed, his boots making no sound in the mud, moving with the kind of deliberate, unhurried pace that young soldiers always mistook for slowness, but was actually something else entirely. It was certainty. Captain Maddox was not in a receptive mood. He was standing in a cluster of NCOs and junior officers, all of them looking at tablets and printouts, and none of them looking happy. When Leonard approached, Maddox barely glanced at him. "Mr. Decka, we're a little busy right now." "I can see that. If you have a suggestion, you can route it through Sergeant Coyle." "I don't have a suggestion, Captain. I have a solution." That got Maddox's attention. He turned fully, and so did every NCO within earshot. Leonard stood there in his faded jacket with his scarred hands at his sides, looking not at the officers, but past them, at the river. There's a stand of loblolly pine about 400 metres upstream on this side. Tall, straight timber, most of it 12 to 16 inches diameter. You've got 2 M88 recovery vehicles in this convoy, which means you've got tow cables rated for 70 tons. You've got chainsaws in the Pioneer toolkits. You've got 300 soldiers standing around watching a broken machine drip hydraulic fluid into the mud. He paused and looked at Maddox directly for the first time. "I can build you a bridge, Captain, a real one. Timber trestle with cable reinforcement. It'll hold everything in your convoy, and I can have it done in 4 hours." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Maddox stared at Leonard. Coyle stared at Leonard. A lieutenant whose name nobody would remember later actually laughed. A short, disbelieving sound that died in his throat when nobody else joined in. Maddox's voice was careful. "Mr. Decka, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but we're talking about a 60-foot span over a Class 4 current. You can't build a bridge out of trees. You can if you know how. With respect, this isn't Vietnam. We have engineering standards, load calculations, safety protocols. You have 47 vehicles that aren't moving and a timeline that's already blown. You have a battalion commander who's going to be on this radio in about 2 hours asking why his convoy is still parked on the wrong side of a river, and you have me." Leonard reached into the chest pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small worn leather case. He opened it and held it out. Inside was a photograph, faded, creased, taken sometime in what looked like the late 1960s. It showed a bridge, a wooden bridge spanning a river that made the one in front of them look like a drainage ditch. The bridge was rough, improvised, clearly built from whatever was available, and on it sat an M48 Patton tank. A tank. On a bridge made of wood and cable in the middle of a jungle crossing a river that had no business being crossed. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting so faded it was almost invisible, were 3 words, Song B, 1968. Leonard closed the case and put it back in his pocket. "I was 23 years old when I built that bridge. 31 men, no power tools, enemy contact on 3 sides. We got an entire armoured column across in 6 hours. What I'm asking you to let me do here is easier than that by a factor of 10. Maddox looked at the photograph's after-image in his mind. He looked at the river. He looked at his useless bridging equipment. Then he looked at Leonard Decka and made the only decision that was actually available to him. What do you need? What happened over the next 3 hours and 47 minutes would become one of those stories that gets told and retold at Fort Benning for years afterward, growing slightly with each telling but never needing to be exaggerated much because the truth was impressive enough. Leonard took command of the worksite with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He gave instructions the way a surgeon gives instructions, precisely, calmly, and with the unspoken expectation that they would be followed without question. He organized the soldiers into 4 teams. The first team, led by Coyle, took chainsaws upstream and began felling loblolly pines to Leonard's exact specifications. He wanted trunks no shorter than 22 feet and no thinner than 12 inches at the narrow end. The second team began clearing and grading the approach on both sides of the crossing, cutting the banks to a specific angle that Leonard marked out with stakes and paracord. The third team rigged the M88 recovery vehicles into position, running their tow cables across the river using a system Leonard described as a messenger line ferry, a technique so old it predated the internal combustion engine, using a light rope thrown across the current, then progressively heavier lines until the main cables could be hauled into position and anchored to the M88s on either bank. The fourth team, under Leonard's direct supervision, began constructing the bridge itself. He built it as a timber trestle, a design that would have been recognizable to a Roman military engineer, which is exactly the point. Some designs survive for 2,000 years because they work. Leonard placed the first crib in the shallows on the near bank, stacking logs in alternating layers and pinning them with stakes driven into the riverbed. The cribs would serve as the piers, supporting the bridge deck above the waterline. Between the cribs he laid stringers, the longest, straightest trunks his cutting team could provide, spanning from pier to pier with their ends notched and lashed to the support structure with cable. On top of the stringers went the decking, shorter logs laid side by side, secured with more cable and ratchet straps borrowed from every vehicle in the convoy. The M88 cables served as the backbone of the entire structure, running along both sides of the bridge like the cables of a suspension span, providing lateral stability and load distribution that turned a collection of logs into something that could actually bear weight. The soldiers who had been standing around watching a machine fail were now building something with their hands, and the transformation was remarkable. There is something about physical, purposeful, cooperative labour that changes the energy of a group. Men and women who had been frustrated and idle 20 minutes earlier were now hauling timber, swinging axes, wading into freezing water up to their chests to position crib logs on the riverbed. Leonard was everywhere and nowhere, appearing at a worksite just as a problem was developing, solving it with a word or a gesture, then moving on. He showed a private how to notch a log so it would seat properly on a stringer. He corrected the angle of a cable anchor by 3 degrees, explaining quietly that the current would shift the load downstream and the anchor needed to compensate. He waded into the river himself at one point, chest deep in water cold enough to stop a younger man's breath, to feel the riverbed with his boots and find the solid footing where a pier needed to sit. He was 71 years old, standing in a freezing river, doing the work he had been born to do. By hour 2, the bridge had reached the midpoint of the river. By hour 3, it was within 15 feet of the far bank. And by hour 3 and 47 minutes, Leonard Decka stood on the far side of the Chattahoochee tributary, his boots sunk in the mud, his clothes soaked, his face unreadable, and watched as the last decking log was secured into place. He walked back across the bridge, slowly, deliberately, feeling every joint and connection through his boots the way a pianist feels keys through fingertips. He stopped in the middle, directly over the deepest part of the channel, and stood there for a full minute while the water roared beneath him and the logs held firm. Then he walked back to the near bank, found Captain Maddox and said, "Send your vehicles." The first vehicle across was a 5-ton supply truck. It weighed approximately 23,000 pounds loaded. The bridge groaned. The cables sang with tension. The logs compressed and shifted and settled, and it held. The truck rolled across at walking pace, its driver white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and reached the far bank without incident. The second vehicle followed, then the third. Then all of them, one by one, 47 vehicles crossing a river that every computer and every young engineer on that bank had declared uncrossable. The M88 recovery vehicles went last, the heaviest loads, the ultimate test, and the bridge held them too because Leonard had built it to hold them, because he had calculated the loads not with a laptop but with 50 years of experience and understanding of timber and water and physics that lived in his hands and his spine and his memory. When the last vehicle cleared the far bank, something happened that nobody ordered and nobody expected. The soldiers on both sides of the river, the ones who had cut the timber, the ones who had hauled the cable, the ones who had stood in freezing water, and the ones who had simply watched, began to applaud. It started with one person, probably Rivera, and it spread until 312 soldiers were clapping and cheering for a 71-year-old man in a faded jacket who was standing on a bridge he'd built with his hands and their hands in a design that was older than their country. Leonard didn't wave, he didn't bow. He stood on that bridge with the river rushing beneath him and let the sound wash over him the way the rain had been washing over him all day. Something natural, something he didn't need to respond to, something that simply was. Captain Maddox crossed the bridge on foot. He walked up to Leonard and stood in front of him for a long moment without speaking. Then he extended his hand. Leonard took it. "Mr. Decka, I owe you an apology." "No, you don't." "I do. I dismissed you. I've been dismissing you for 3 weeks." "You've been doing your job, Captain. You've got good equipment and good soldiers and good training. Sometimes the river's just bigger than the plane." Maddox held Leonard's hand a moment longer than a handshake requires. "Where did you learn to do this?" Leonard was quiet for a beat. 18th Engineer Brigade, 1967 to 1970. 3 tours. We built bridges, roads, airstrips, fire bases, mostly under fire, mostly with whatever we could find. Wood, steel, bamboo, wrecked vehicles. Didn't matter. The mission was movement, and we made movement happen." He paused. "The army gave me a Bronze Star and a bad back and told me I was done. But you don't stop being an engineer. It's not a job. It's how you see the world. Every river's a problem, and every problem's got a bridge in it if you look hard enough." What Leonard didn't tell Maddox, what he never told anyone unless directly asked, and sometimes not even then, was the full scope of what he had done in Vietnam. Leonard Decka had served as a combat engineer in some of the most intense operational environments of the entire war. At Song Bi in 1968, during a massive offensive push, his unit had been tasked with getting armour across a river that was wider and faster than anything they'd trained for, with North Vietnamese forces actively engaging them from the far tree line. Leonard, then a young sergeant, had designed and supervised the construction of a timber and cable bridge under direct fire. 2 men in his team were killed during the construction. Leonard himself took shrapnel in his left shoulder from a mortar round that landed 30 feet from the bridge site. He finished the bridge with his arm in a sling standing in the river, refusing evacuation until the last vehicle was across. He received the Bronze Star for that action, but the men who were there said he deserved more. They said he deserved everything the army had to give. But Leonard never talked about it, because the men who do the most rarely talk the most, and because the bridge was its own reward. The simple, undeniable proof that the river had been crossed, and the mission had continued, and the soldiers had gotten where they needed to go. Word of what happened at the river crossing travelled fast. By that evening, Colonel James Whitford, the battalion commander, drove out to the crossing site personally. He stood on the bank and looked at Leonard's bridge, still standing, still solid, the river still trying and failing to move it, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked to meet the man who built it. When Leonard was brought over, Colonel Whitford studied him for a moment, the faded jacket, the scarred hands, the quiet eyes, and then did something that surprised every soldier watching. He came to attention. A full-bird colonel, standing at attention for a civilian contractor in a worn-out jacket. "Sergeant Decka," he said, using a rank Leonard hadn't held in decades. "I served under a man in the First Gulf War who told me a story about a bridge at Song Bi. He said it was the finest piece of combat engineering he'd ever seen, built by a sergeant who wouldn't leave the water until the job was done. He said that sergeant was the reason 47 men in his platoon made it home." Leonard said nothing. His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible reaction. "I've been in the army for 26 years, Colonel Whitford continued. I have never seen anything like what you did here today. You didn't just build a bridge, Sergeant. You reminded every soldier in this battalion what engineering actually means. It doesn't mean machines. It doesn't mean technology. It means looking at a problem and refusing to accept that it can't be solved. He paused. On behalf of this battalion, and personally, thank you. The aftermath was significant. Colonel Whitford submitted a formal commendation for Leonard through civilian channels, and he also did something more practical. He requested that Leonard be given an expanded role in the battalion's training program, not as a contractor sitting in the back of a Humvee, as an instructor. Within 2 months, Leonard Decka was teaching a course he designed himself, officially titled Expedient Construction Methods, but known to every soldier who took it simply as Decka's Bridge. The course taught young engineers how to look at a landscape the way Leonard looked at it, not as a series of obstacles, but as a collection of materials waiting to be assembled. How to build with timber when the aluminum ran out. How to calculate loads by feel when the computers went down. How to see the bridge inside the river. Captain Maddox became one of Leonard's strongest advocates. He wrote a paper for the Engineer School Journal about the incident at the river crossing, arguing that the Army's increasing reliance on complex technology-dependent bridging systems had created a dangerous gap in basic engineering competency. The paper cited Leonard's bridge as proof that fundamental skills, the kind that don't require batteries or hydraulic fluid or satellite uplinks, remain essential in combat engineering. The paper was read widely. It started conversations that hadn't been happening. And at the centre of all of it was a 71-year-old man who had never asked for attention and didn't particularly want it, but who had stood in a freezing river and built something that 300 soldiers and 47 computers said couldn't be built. Leonard continued teaching at Fort Benning for 3 more years. He taught 4 cycles of young engineers, and every single one of them came out of his course knowing how to build a bridge from nothing, because Leonard had taught them something no textbook contains, that the greatest piece of engineering equipment ever devised is the human mind backed by the willingness to get into the water. On the day he finally retired for good at 74, his last class of students built him a bridge. A small one, just a footbridge over a creek near the training area, made from timber and cable using the techniques he had taught them. They put a plaque on it. It read, Decka's Bridge, for the man who reminded us that every river has a crossing. Leonard stood at that bridge for a long time, his hand resting on the railing his students had built, and if his eyes were wet, nobody mentioned it, because some things don't need to be said, they just need to be built. The river was uncrossable until it wasn't, until a man who had spent his whole life building bridges walked to the edge of the water and saw what no one else could see. Not the obstacle, but the path through it. If you believe that experience deserves respect, that the people who built this country with their hands still have something to teach us, then subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and the next time you see someone you think you figured out, someone older, someone quieter, someone easy to overlook, remember Leonard Decka, remember the bridge, and remember that the river is never uncrossable. You just haven't met the right engineer yet.